Today we're going to cover 5 foods and we're going to dig into the science behind each one and most importantly, what to actually do about it. This is not about what gets hyped up on TikTok. And it's also not what the food industry wants me to say. This is just straight science. This is when I go to the peer-reviewed literature and I emerge with the evidence that shows you what the actual papers are saying. I'm a gastroenterologist. I've been reading these papers for 20 years. I have a master's of clinical investigation from Northwestern. So we're going to do this the right way. 5 foods, 5 provocative real studies, what they showed, what we learned, and the practical move at the end of each one. Are you ready? Let's go. Okay, one thing first before we dive in, because most of the noise in this space gets this part totally wrong. Inflammation is 2 things. Acute inflammation is what happens when you sprain your ankle. It's red, it's warm, it's tender, obviously it's swollen. That's actually recovery. That's good. But there's a different thing. Chronic low-grade inflammation, and it's the kind that quietly runs in the background for years. It's a slightly elevated CRP, a slightly elevated IL-6, a slightly elevated TNF-alpha. You don't necessarily feel it day to day, but it's the kind of thing that can be tied to heart disease, type 2 diabetes, autoimmune conditions, and a lot of people who are just feeling off and they're feeling tired. Today is actually about that kind of inflammation, the chronic kind. Now, I don't want to overblow what we're going to discuss here. One food by itself doesn't cause disease. I just want to be clear on that. And your body is actually incredibly resilient. So enjoying cake, ice cream cake, these things on occasion really aren't a big deal. But here's where we're going with this. Each of these 5 foods has consistent peer-reviewed evidence linking them to chronic low-grade inflammatory patterns. And each one comes with what to do, not just the fear. Let's start with food number 1, processed meats. Here's the myth. It's just a little deli meat. Bacon is fine in moderation. The cancer thing is overblown. They put everything in the same category as cigarettes. Okay, now let's actually look at the data. In 2022, researchers used the UK Biobank data, which includes over 400,000 men and women, to look at habitual meat consumption and inflammatory markers. And they separated out unprocessed red meat, processed meat, and poultry. And then they measured the C-reactive protein and the white blood cell count. These are common markers of inflammation that your doctor can check. Processed meat had the strongest inflammatory signal of any meat type. Every 50 grams of processed meat was associated with a 38% higher C-reactive protein level. Unprocessed red meat came in at 14%, and poultry came in at 13%. Both increased inflammatory markers, but not the same as the processed meats. Processed meat was nearly triple the signal. And this isn't just about inflammation. In 2015, the World Health Organization's International Agency for Research on Cancer reviewed over 800 studies. And what they emerged with is the determination to classify processed meat as a group 1 carcinogen, meaning that there is sufficient evidence that it causes cancer in humans, specifically colorectal cancer. Now, what they found, if you eat 1 hot dog a day, you are increasing your risk by 18% of developing colorectal cancer. Now, I've heard some people basically dismiss these data, even though it was 800 studies that were being reviewed, and say, oh, well, this is not a big deal. That's not that much of a risk. Have you noticed that colorectal cancer is the number 2 cause of cancer death in America? Have you noticed that colorectal cancer is now starting to affect people who are younger than they used to be? Certainly we have a problem, but also there's an entire mechanistic basis for how processed meats actually turn into colorectal cancer. And there are at least 4 major ways that this happens: N-nitroso compounds, polycystic aromatic hydrocarbons, heterocyclic amines, heme iron. But then there's the part that we haven't even talked about yet that actually you're probably the most interested in, the gut microbiome, where they have shown that processed meats actually shift the microbiome towards pro-inflammatory species while simultaneously reducing the beneficial bacteria that are trying to protect you. And they also have found that they disrupt the tight junctions that keep your gut barrier intact. And a leaky gut translates into inflammation through bacterial endotoxin. When you take a step back and you look at the totality of the evidence, processed meats need to be limited at a minimum. Okay, I have two important caveats for the research nerds out there. Number one, in the UK Biobank study, they did find that the data was confounded by body mass index. People who were eating more processed meats were disproportionately having high body mass index, which of course could indicate obesity. Body mass index is a risk factor for colorectal cancer. But within this study, when they controlled for that, what they were able to isolate is that processed meats are still also a clear risk factor for the development of colorectal cancer. Number two, when something is labeled as a group 1 carcinogen, that is indicative of the certainty of evidence. So what that means is that after a review of all of these papers, they can say that processed meats are associated with the development of colorectal cancer. And in a similar fashion, they say that smoking is associated with lung cancer. Now, it doesn't mean that it's the same level of risk. There's a difference between being stung by a bee and being bit by a poisonous snake. I personally would rather be stung by a bee, but I don't particularly want either. The evidence doesn't just support like a moderation approach to processed meats, that we really need to try to minimize these processed meats as much as possible. So that includes bacon, deli meats, sausages, hot dogs. I'm sorry if you love these things. I promise you, I used to love these things. I had like 2 hot dogs a day when I was a kid, but we really want to try to minimize that. So the dose response here is clear and it's linear. Less is better, none is best. Before you start yelling at me, I just want to say, this is the one where like people get very worked up on both sides. I want you to pay attention and let me walk you all the way through. And we're going to start once again with the myth. Seed oils cause inflammation. Linoleic acid burns your cells. They're toxic. All right, the most honest answer isn't that, oh, the panic is right or, oh, the panic is wrong. It's actually somewhere in the middle. So I want to really explain this. The highest tier of evidence that we have on this question are randomized controlled trials in humans, asking the direct question, what happens when you give people more linoleic acid in their diet? Do their inflammatory markers go up? A systematic review pooled 15 RCTs in healthy adults and asked exactly that. C-reactive protein, fibrinogen, PI1, TNF-alpha, soluble adhesion molecules, everything across the board. Here's what they said, almost word for word. There is virtually no evidence from randomized controlled trials in healthy humans showing that adding linoleic acid to the diet increases inflammatory markers. That's the strongest data we have. The reality is it does not support the viral claims. But here's where the nuance is real. Number one, when you repeatedly heat oils, it's bad. It's always bad. Butter, beef tallow, treated the same way, would also degrade and have these same issues. When you heat them to high temperatures and you reuse them over and over again, what ends up happening is that you develop these oxidized lipid byproducts that are toxic. So this is a deep fryer problem. It's not really a seed oil specific problem. Number two, and this, by the way, is the one that really matters to me the most, seed oils are most commonly found in ultra-processed foods. When a person goes to actually cut out seed oils, really what they're typically doing is they're cutting back on ultra-processed foods. And then what do you know? They feel better, they lose weight, their C-reactive protein drops, but it wasn't actually the seed oil the entire time. It was the ultra-processed food that was really doing the work. And then number three, replacing seed oils with butter or beef tallow does not lower inflammatory markers in trials. It raises LDL cholesterol. So you're trading one concern for actually a bigger one. That is not an upgrade. That's a step in the wrong direction. So the practical move is this. When I am preparing food at room temperature, I like to opt for extra virgin olive oil. The polyphenols that you will find in extra virgin olive oil, that's the good stuff. That's what actually helps and supports my gut microbiome. And when we do that, it's not really about the absence of seed oils. It's the fact that you chose a higher quality food. But I'm also going to skip the deep fryer. And if I am going to cook with heat, I typically will opt for avocado oil. I want you to cut ultra processed foods because here's the truth. That's where most of the seed oils sit. And really, that's not just a seed oil thing. That's an ultra processed food thing. So what I've seen out there is that like the viral version of what we're talking about is a lot louder on social media than what I see when I go and I start digging into the evidence. Food number three, added sugar. Here's the myth. Sugar is sugar. Fruit and a soda are the same thing. If I'm not diabetic, it doesn't really matter with sugar. That's not an inflammation problem. Here's what the evidence actually shows. In 2023, a team published the largest umbrella review ever done on dietary sugar and health. They pulled together 73 meta-analyses from over 8,600 studies covering 83 different health outcomes. The main finding from this study is that increased sugar intake was associated with 45 different harmful health outcomes. That includes metabolic disease, cardiovascular disease, cancer, depression, and even death. Their recommendation was to limit the free sugar in our diet to no more than 25 grams per day. That's about 6 teaspoons. One can of Coke has 39 grams. So one can of Coke is everything from a day and then half of your next day too. In 2025, new US dietary guidelines were released. And let me be honest, there's a lot in there that I do not agree with. But there was this one thing when it comes to sugar where I think they got it right. The federal government, for the first time, said no amount of added sugars or non-nutritive sweeteners is recommended or considered part of a healthy or nutritious diet. They capped the amount at 10 grams per meal, and most Americans, unfortunately, will blow past this by breakfast. So let me share the mechanism for how this works. Chronic excess added sugar drives the chronic inflammatory pattern through a very well-established cascade. It activates insulin resistance, it pushes visceral fat, it is increasing inflammatory cytokines, IL-6 and TNF-alpha. Basically, this is an engine that revs up into chronic low-grade inflammation, and it doesn't actually matter whether a person has diabetes or not. And when this happens, it actually impacts the gut. A 2018 study in the journal Science showed that high blood sugar, even in the short term, can actually reprogram the cells lining the intestinal wall, disrupting the tight junction proteins that hold it together and increasing gut permeability. Lipopolysaccharide sneaks across and activates inflammatory pathways. The worse the blood sugar, the more permeable the gut. Now, some people have tried to pretend that whole fruit is the same thing because it has whatever number of grams of sugar in it. That is not real. That is completely made up. A whole apple has so much to offer your body and your gut microbiome. It's got fiber, polyphenols, other phytochemicals. It's got water. It's even got what we call the food matrix, which is the structure of the food. And actually, by the way, that's quite important. The sugar is bound up in all of this. And the result is that the absorption is very slow. You get a much more stable blood sugar curve, and the fiber, meanwhile, is feeding your gut microbiome all the way through. Put that up against apple juice, which comes from the exact same fruit, but in this case, we're throwing away the fiber and we're extracting what's mostly sugar. It may have the same calories, it doesn't have the fiber, and it hits the bloodstream like a freaking rocket. In a 2022 meta-analysis of 64 controlled feeding trials, they found that sugar-sweetened beverages and whole fruit actually go in the opposite direction from one another when it comes to inflammation. So you might have an apple and apple juice coming from the exact same food, and the apple juice will raise C-reactive protein, and meanwhile, the apple will lower it. Anyone who tells you sugar is sugar, they don't know what they're talking about. The context is extremely important. Give me the whole fruit every single time. So here's the practical move. We want to cut added sugar, the kind that's added in manufacturing or at the table. But no, we don't want to cut the whole fruit out. US labels have been required to break out added sugars specifically since 2020, but the highest leverage swap that you can make in this context is to actually replace the sugar sweetened thing with something that's real. That single swap can be massively difference making. Food number 4 is alcohol. Now here's the myth. A glass of red wine a day is good for you. The Mediterranean diet includes wine, so it must be fine. Here's what the evidence actually shows. The global burden of disease in 2016 alcohol study, which was, by the way, published in The Lancet, one of the top medical journals out there, is the largest study of alcohol and health data ever assembled. They looked across 195 countries, 26 years of data, and 23 different health outcomes. And their conclusion, which in their own words was this: the level of alcohol consumption that minimizes harm across health outcomes is 0 standard drinks per week Across the globe, alcohol is the seventh leading risk factor for death and disability across all ages. For adults aged 15 to 49, it's literally the leading risk factor. This entire idea that moderate drinkers live longer was a signal that we saw in older studies, but actually it hasn't held up through the years. New, better controlled epidemiology studies have adjusted for what's called the sick quitter problem, as well as the healthy user bias. There are people who consume alcohol to the point that it actually causes health issues for them, and they stop drinking. And then they get enrolled in a study. And guess what? In the study, it says they abstain from alcohol. This abstention group ends up looking like they're super sick. And meanwhile, the moderate drinkers who haven't yet experienced any health issues because it's just a little taste on a consistent daily basis, those people end up looking healthier. But really, it's just a miscategorization problem. And it brings us back to understanding what's really going on the inside. The mechanism for inflammation here is directly connected to the gut, because what we have found in our research is that alcohol increases gut barrier permeability. And when that happens, bacterial endotoxin or lipopolysaccharide starts to sneak across the gut barrier, and that activates inflammatory pathways. The result is inflammation. We also know that alcohol disrupts the gut microbiome. It shifts the microbiome towards more inflammatory species and away from the beneficial short-chain fatty acid producers. So what you get is less short-chain fatty acids, which are anti-inflammatory, and you get more of the gut bacteria that are pro-inflammatory. That is not a good trade-off. And alcohol, by the way, is also a group 1 carcinogen per the IARC. There is a consistent dose-response relationship between alcohol consumption and breast, esophageal, colorectal, liver, head, and neck cancers. So here's the practical move from my perspective. Less is better. 0 is the lowest risk option that exists. So if you drink, please don't do it because you heard that it was anti-inflammatory or that it was good for you. If you're going to drink, you should drink because you enjoy it and you know the math. A beer or a glass of wine on occasion is not that big of a deal. Where I have concerns is the consistent daily consumption of alcohol. And as for the Mediterranean diet and how wine gets framed within that diet, what's going on there is that the dietary pattern is protective. It's the food, the olive oil, the legumes, the vegetables, the healthy protein, the social eating. So the lowest risk dose is 0. That doesn't mean that any glass is dangerous. It just means that the wine isn't the part that's helping you. And number 5 are ultra processed foods. So here's the myth. Ultra processed just means packaged. It's cleaner than it used to be. Here's what the evidence actually shows. In 2024, a team of researchers published an umbrella review in the British Medical Journal. This is a meta-analysis of meta-analyses. This is the highest tier of research evidence that exists. And they brought together 45 meta-analyses for 45 different health outcomes involving nearly 10 million people. And what they found was that out of those 45, 32 of them found ultra-processed foods to be significantly associated with increased health risk. Now, by the way, out of 45, there were actually 42 of them that were trending towards the ultra-processed foods actually causing harm. They found all-cause mortality, which means death from any cause, up by 21% with ultra-processed food intake. Ultra-processed foods were associated with higher cardiovascular disease-related mortality, higher type 2 diabetes incidence, higher anxiety, higher rates of common mental disorders. They found heart disease mortality, the number 1 cause of death in America today, up by 66%. Depression, poor sleep, wheezing, obesity, again, 32 different health outcomes significantly associated with ultra-processed foods. This is one of the most consistent and convergent signals in modern nutrition science today. In 2019, a team at the NIH, led by Dr. Kevin Hall, ran an inpatient, randomized crossover trial involving 20 adults and 2 diets, ultra-processed versus unprocessed. Everything was matched for calories, energy density, sugar, sodium, fiber, and other macronutrients. The participants were told, eat until you're full. Here's what happened. On the ultra-processed diet, people ate about 500 extra calories per day. What that means is that during the course of a week, they're gaining an extra pound simply because the food is ultra-processed. Same person, same menu when it came to calories, but a totally different outcome based upon the processing. Ultra-processed foods are engineered to be what we call hyperpalatable. You're never satiated. And that's the result of the disproportionate, unnatural amounts of salt, sugar, and fat. And when it comes to the gut, ultra-processed foods, unfortunately, are stripped of fiber. Why do you think we have such a fiber deficiency in America today? It's because this is where we're getting most of our food from. The result is that the microbiome starves, it starts shifting towards more inflammatory species, the gut barrier breaks down, and then here we go, chronic low-grade inflammation once again. And it's not just the absence of fiber, it's also what's in the ultra-processed foods that we need to acknowledge. There's now an emerging amount of evidence with dietary emulsifiers, things like carboxymethylcellulose, polysorbate 80, and carrageenan that are in all kinds of stuff, ice cream, salad dressings, non-dairy milks. There was a study in 2015 in the journal Nature where even food-grade concentrations of these compounds were disrupting the mucus layer in the gut and allowing bacteria to actually get across the intestinal wall, triggering inflammation and metabolic syndrome. A follow-up study in 2021 tested 20 common emulsifiers on the human gut microbiota and found that most of them shifted the microbial community towards a more inflammatory state. But here's the key part. Ultra-processed food is where most of the other 4 foods on this list actually live. Most of the added sugar in American diet, ultra-processed. Most of the processed red meat, ultra-processed. Most of the seed oil exposure, ultra-processed. The drinks, the spritzers, yeah, ultra-processed. This is the highest leverage move that you can make with ultra-processed foods. If you can solve this one, you're solving a whole bunch of things all at once. So I'm not trying to be perfect with my diet. I'm leaving a little bit of room for me to eat things. And yes, I do include some ultra-processed foods in my diet. I like to think of like an 80-20 frame, but I'm trying to be more home-cooked, more recognizable food 80% of the time. The pattern is what really matters because ultimately we're striving towards a higher quality diet. Now, I hope that you noticed what we didn't do today. I'm not telling you that these things alone are giving you disease. I'm not trying to make you scared of your food. I'm telling you what the peer-reviewed research papers are saying, what the practical move is, and which decisions can solve your problems. The biggest gains in fighting chronic inflammation aren't from what you remove. They're from what you add. Fiber, polyphenols, plant diversity, fermented foods, healthy fats, the 4 workhorses that I discussed in Plant Powered Plus as my anti-inflammatory backbone. Now, if this discussion on inflammation has resonated with you, I want you to know you can go deeper. I have an anti-inflammatory workshop that I'm so excited to share with you, where I'm going to walk you through exactly how inflammation works in your body and why it matters. Completely free. So grab the link in the description and I'll see you there.